How's it going, guys? This is going to be video 1 for APUSH for Monday, April 20th. I highly encourage you to go check out Moodle today because as of today and every Monday from now until the end of the school year, we're going to be posting assignments once a week. For you, it's going to be probably 3 DBQs, and then I don't know what the fourth one will be, but for practice for the AP test, you're going to get DBQ practice. So that's posted now. But let's resume back where we were. We're still on the packet review reading 5, heading towards Civil War and Reconstruction. We left off right in the middle of Civil War. We're picking up on the sections PDF page, find it, 174, the election of 1864, and the end of the Civil War. Okay. As the 1864 presidential election approached, and popular opinion in both the North and South favored an end to the war, Lincoln's opponent, General George McClellan, campaigned on a peace platform. In the South, citizens openly defied the civil authority. It should be re-emphasized that less than 1% of the Southern population owned more than 100 slaves, and as the war dragged on, many small non-slaveholding farmers resented the Confederacy and the war, which they now believed was being waged merely to protect the planter aristocracy's lifestyle. In the North, some war Democrats considered the war was necessary to preserve the Union. Others, called the Copperheads, accused Lincoln of instigating a national social revolution and criticized his administration's policies as a thinly disguised attempt to destroy the South. Nowhere, however, was opposition to the war more violent than in New York City, where racial, ethnic, and class antagonisms exploded into the draft riots of July of 1863. Irish immigrants, mostly the poor working class who were already victims of nativism, resented being drafted into a war being fought to end slavery. Many immigrants feared that once freed, former slaves would migrate north into the northern cities to compete with them for low-paying labor jobs, and yet both sides fought on. Just when a stalemate might have forced an end to the war, things began improving for the North. Victories throughout the summer of 1864 played a large part in helping Lincoln gain re-election. By the early spring of 1865, a Union victory was virtually assured, and the government established the Freedmen's Bureau to help newly liberated blacks establish a place in post-war society. The Bureau helped with immediate problems of survival, food, housing, and developed social institutions such as schools. Some historians see the Freedmen's Bureau as the first federal social welfare program in U.S. history. In April of 1865, the Confederate leaders surrendered. John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln just 5 days later, with devastating consequences for the reunited nation. The Civil War was fought at enormous cost. More than 3 million men fought in the war, and in all of them, more than 500,000 people died. At least as many were seriously wounded. Both governments ran up huge debts during the war, and much of the South was ravaged by Union soldiers. During Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea in the fall of 1864, the Union Army burned everything in its wake to destroy the Confederate morale and deplete the South's material resources, foreshadowing the wide-scale warfare of the 20th century. From a political perspective, the war permanently expanded the role of government. On both sides, government grew rapidly to manage the economy in the war. Reconstruction and Johnson's impeachment. At war's end, 3 major questions faced the United Union. First, under what conditions would the Southern states be readmitted to the Union? Second, what would be the status of blacks in the post-war nation? Black leaders hoped that their service in the military would earn blacks equal rights. The newly liberated slaves, called freedmen, were primarily interested in the chance to earn wages and own property. And third, what should be done with the rebels? Reconstruction may be seen as both a time period and a process. As a time period, Reconstruction usually refers to the years between 1865 and 1877, that is, from the end of the Civil War until the end of military Reconstruction, when the Union Army withdrew from the South. The process of Reconstruction, however, was complicated and complex, and some argue it continues even to this day. Reconstruction involved readmitting the Southern states that had seceded from the Union, physically reconstructing and rebuilding Southern towns, cities, and property that had been destroyed during the war. Finally, integrating newly freed blacks into American society is this last process that has proven to be most difficult. The process of Reconstruction had begun even before the Civil War ended, although not without controversy. As President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Lincoln had claimed that he had authority to determine the conditions under which the Southern states might be readmitted to the Union. Lincoln had no intention of punishing the South and wanted to end the war and reunite the nation quickly and painlessly, as his immortal words from his second inaugural address indicate. With malice towards none, and with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us the right to see, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Lincoln's plan is usually referred to as the 10% plan and simply required 10% of those voters who had voted in the 1860 election swear an oath of allegiance to the Union and accept emancipation through the 13th Amendment. These men would then reorganize their state government and reapply for admission to the Union. The Congress had another vision, however. It viewed the southern states as conquered territory, and as such, radical Republicans in Congress argued that we're under jurisdiction of Congress, not the President. Most Republicans agreed that Lincoln's plan was too lenient and enacted the Wade-Davis Bill in July of *64. This act provided that former Confederate states be ruled by a military governor and required 50% of the electorate to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. A state convention would then be organized to repeal their ordinance of secession and abolish slavery within their state. It should be noted that neither Lincoln's 10% plan nor the Wade-Davis Bill made any provisions for black suffrage. Lincoln's pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis Bill, effectively destroying it. Lincoln was assassinated the following year. With Lincoln's assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency. Johnson, a Southern Democrat, had opposed secession and strongly supported Lincoln during his first term. In return, Lincoln rewarded Johnson with the vice presidency. When the war ended, Congress was in recess and would not reconvene for 8 months. That left the early stages of Reconstruction entirely in Johnson's hands. Johnson had lifted himself from poverty and held no great love for the South's elite planters, and at first he seemed intent on taking the power away from the old aristocracy and giving it to the yeomen, farmers. Johnson's Reconstruction plan, which was based on a plan approved by Lincoln, called for the creation of provisional military governments to run the states until they were readmitted to the Union. It also required all Southern citizens to swear a loyalty oath before receiving amnesty for the rebellion. However, it barred many of the former Southern elite, including plantation owners, Confederate officers, and government officials from taking that vow, thus prohibiting their participation in the new governments. According to this plan, the provisional governments would hold state constitutional conventions, at which time the states would have to write new constitutions, eliminating slavery and renouncing secession. Johnson did not require the states to enfranchise blacks by giving them the vote. The plan did not work, mostly because Johnson pardoned many of the Southern elite who were supposed to have been excluded from the reunification process. After the states drafted new constitutions and elected new governments, former Confederate officials were again in positions of great power. Furthermore, many of their new constitutions were only slight revisions of previous constitutions. Southern legislators also passed new black codes limiting freedmen's rights to assemble and travel, instituting curfews and requiring blacks to carry special passes. In the most egregious instances, state legislatures simply took their old slave codes and replaced the word slaves with freedmen. When Congress reconvened in December of 1865, the new Southern senators included the Vice President of the Confederacy and other Confederate officials. Northern congressmen were not pleased. Invoking its constitutional right to examine the credentials of new members, Congress voted not to seat the new Southern delegations, then it set about examining Johnson's Reconstruction plan. Congress is divided among conservative Republicans, who generally agree with Johnson's plan, moderates, who were a large enough contingent to swing a vote in one or the other direction, and radical Republicans. The radical Republicans wanted to extend democracy in the South. Following the Civil War, most important political positions were held by appointees. Very few officials were directly elected. The most radical among the radical Republicans advocated a Reconstruction program that punished the South for seceding. Historians at the time suggested that revenge was the real motivation behind the passage of the 13th Amendment, although contemporary historians have dismissed this idea. Under General Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, land seized from Confederates was to be redistributed among the new freedmen, but President Andrew Johnson rescinded Sherman's order, and the idea of giving freedmen 40 acres and a mule never regained much ground. All Republicans agreed to Johnson's Reconstruction needed some modification, but Johnson refused to compromise. Instead, he declared Reconstruction over and done with, vetoing a compromise package that would have extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau and enforced a uniform civil rights code in the South. Congress overrode Johnson's vetoes, which only increased tension between the two branches of federal government. In response, the radicals drew up the plan that came to be known as the Congressional Reconstruction. Its first component was the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The amendment stated that if you were born in the United States, you are a citizen. 2. Prohibited states from depriving any citizen of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. 3. Prevented states from denying any citizen equal protection of the law. And then 4 gave states the choice either to give freemen the right to vote or to stop counting them among their voting population for the purpose of congressional reapportionment. 5 barred prominent Confederates from holding political office. And 6 excused the Confederacy's war debt. Okay, stop first video.